Hello and welcome to a Wilson Center Polar Institute special event on the Arctic and U.S. national security. Hi, I'm John Molesky. I'm joined for the entirety of the series, a 5-part series here on GCI, by my colleague Mike Sfraga. Mike is director of the Wilson Center's Global Risk and Resilience Program and also the Polar Institute. And Mike, part 2 of our series is titled Strategies for a New Arctic. What will we be hearing about?
Yeah, John, this is a fascinating panel because when you hear of 5 experts who is speaking about individual planning and pathways for the Arctic from their particular perspective. So we'll get some insight from Shannon Jenkins, who will speak to us about the Coast Guard's path forward for a new Arctic. We'll hear from Iris Ferguson, who will share the Air Force's perspectives and their path forward for the Arctic. Jeffrey Barker from the Navy and the Navy's perspective, not just on the Arctic, but how they will operate in the Arctic. And we'll hear from David Kennedy, who's the Senior Arctic Advisor for NOAA. And of course, NOAA supports many branches of the federal government. So this provides us a really critical insight into not only what is currently happening with their particular areas, but how they will move forward in this new market.
Mike, is there an Arctic command? Is this all coordinated from the Pentagon's point of view?
There is not an Arctic command. Each branch of the military, branch of federal governments, they all have strategy planners and they all have command planners, but none of these are coordinated across any part. So there's no whole of
It's really exciting
approach.
that you bring them together in this manner. Let's take a look and then we'll be back.
To my left is Shannon Jenkins. He's the Senior Arctic Policy Advisor from the U.S. Coast Guard. Then Miss Iris Ferguson. She's a Senior Advisor for the Air Force. Mr. Jeff Barker, Deputy Branch Head for Policy and Posture at the Navy. And Mr. David Kennedy, the Senior Arctic Advisor for NOAA. What I've asked them to each to do in a relatively short period of time is to condense where their policies and their pathways currently are. And each will take a few moments to do that. And then we'll come back, have a discussion here, and then I would invite the audience to discuss with us the various issues that were brought up.
The Coast Guard has been operating in the Arctic for 150 years, and during that time, the Arctic landscape has dramatically changed, physically, operationally, and strategically. And it continues to do so at an accelerating pace. Our statutory mission, responsibilities, and obligations in the Arctic are the same as they are anywhere else, which is to ensure the safety, security, and stewardship of and in U.S. waters. This includes enforcing laws and regulations, conducting search and rescue, advancing navigation safety, protecting living marine sources, securing the homeland. But what's unique about the Arctic is that it remains one of the world's most challenging operational environments due to extreme weather, tyranny of distance, limited infrastructure, and minimal and aging capabilities. But amidst all these challenges and changes also lie unprecedented opportunities for the U.S. as well as other nation states, making Arctic one of the most competitive spaces in which we operate. So let's talk a little bit about those challenges and changes for our Arctic strategy. Start with the physical environment. Certainly know that the ice is there's diminished amounts of ice, which translates into longer periods of access. Also means increasing intensity and frequency of storms, as well as significant impacts on subsistence hunting and fishing for Alaska natives. And diminished ice doesn't mean ice-free. Single-year ice melts. We're finding that larger amounts of higher, thicker, denser multi-year ice are moving in to fill that void. Commandant mentioned that we weren't able to get a whitehall up above around the North Slope this year because a significant amount of ice blew in to Ukqiavik area and stayed for a significant amount of time, prevented our operations out there that far east. So the operational environment. For the Coast Guard, we're seeing a greater demand signal for our services to include expanding number of SAR cases and regulatory enforcement. It's also a growing and evolving types of human activity. In 2010, the Coast Guard produced a high-latitude mission analysis report. And some of the key findings in there were that oil and gas extraction was going to be a primary driver and that tourism was only going to play a minor role in Arctic activity. That certainly flipped around. Commandant mentioned the Maersk exploratory transit. Well, as I understand it, just a few years ago, they made a public statement saying they didn't have any interest in exploring transitory, the Arctic transition route or the transitory routes. Graphics on these slides are just a few examples of the types of analytics we do to develop and review to inform our operational and policy decisions. Bar graph on your left shows the number and types of vessels operating in the U.S. Arctic by year. Although there's a slight dip after 2015, after Shell pulled out, what we're seeing though is that activity is fairly steadily growing And what we're seeing for the 2018 numbers is that we anticipated to be back up around those 26 numbers. So we're not anticipating any slowdown in the activities. And again, that one example of an emergent growth or surge area is tourism. That bottom right graph shows that the tourism industry expects a significant increase in the amount of passenger bookings in the Arctic region. Doesn't mean just the U.S. Arctic, but across the Arctic. Another tell is that they also expect 28 new Arctic expedition ships by 2022, some of which are projected to be as capable as our icebreaker Healy, which to me is an indication that these cruise operators are potentially planning North Pole excursions. Another important impact of the increased activity is that it has potential to disrupt the migration patterns and thus the hunting and fishing grounds of Alaska natives, which means we have to balance that economic opportunity and growth with the impacts on the people that live in that region. So look at the strategic geopolitical environment. As Commandant mentioned before, more and more states are expressing interest in exerting influence in the Arctic. One tell of that is the Arctic Council, where now we have almost double the number of observer states as we do the member states. South Korea has had a research vessel in the Arctic for the past several years, and Japan recently released an Arctic strategy language as well. Of course, can't talk about the Arctic without talking about Russia and China. Commandant hit on them pretty heavily, but just to reemphasize, they both declared the Arctic as a strategic priority, either explicitly or through their actions. All aware that Russia has the most icebreakers of any nation, they're recapitalizing and building new infrastructure across their North Slope to include military bases and capabilities. That said, as Commandant mentioned, we have a good working relationship with the Russian border guard, as we have similar interests related to illegal fisheries, search and rescue, and spill response. With China, they certainly have Arctic aspirations. China released their Arctic policy document back in January. This past September, they took delivery of their second icebreaker, which is their first home-built icebreaker. They certainly aren't building icebreakers for nothing. Talk about Canada just for a second as our closest both ally and our closest neighbor in the Arctic. Canada last year released a defense policy document with the moniker Strong, Secure, Engaged. Arctic is prominently featured in it, and it addresses a lot of similar issues and concerns that we have. Arctic security, great power competition, gray zone conflict, and also the need for enhanced cooperation. I mention this specifically because the language is very similar to the language that we have in our 2017 National Security Strategy and our 2018 National Defense Strategy. Both talk about increased great power competition across the globe and the need to be able to respond, influence, and shape those competitive spaces. Neither document calls out the Arctic specifically. Well, NSS has a slight mention on, I think, like page 40. But other than that, it's not hard to draw the linkages between those objectives in these documents and the Arctic. For example, the NSS talks about leading in multilateral forums, which the U.S. has certainly done in forums like the Arctic Council, Arctic Coast Guard Forum, and International Maritime Organization. The NSS also states that competition doesn't necessarily lead to conflict, as Commandant mentioned, but that in America, that successfully competes is the best way to prevent that conflict. Talk about where we're going with our strategy a little bit. As Commandant mentioned, we first published an Arctic strategy in 2013 with a 10-year planning horizon. So at about its half-life, it's a natural time for us to review and affirm our Arctic intentions based on the changes that have occurred in the last 5 years. Coast Guard vision is largely unchanged, which is a cooperative, safe, and secure domain that enables legal, environmentally responsible maritime activity. This end state must also harmonize the needs and requirements of other Arctic's diverse stakeholders with the preservation of the United States' national security interests. We also continue to invest in the original 3 objectives because they remain sound and valid, because we've had positive outcomes in both the operational and strategic environments through them. These objectives are improving domain awareness, modernizing governance, and broadening partnerships. But what we are updating is a renewed emphasis on why the Arctic matters, with a very specific national security focus. All of our Arctic objectives have a linkage to national security, and the ways and means by which we impact Arctic security are through leadership, cooperation, and presence. I want to clarify what we mean by national security. Neither the 2017 NSS or 2018 NDS define national security, and I'm certainly not going to try to do that either. But what I found more often than not is when I hear people talk about national security, they often think about national defense. I was glad to hear Mike broaden that out a little bit, talk about border security, and I forget the other ones, economic security, and a couple others you threw in there, but which hits what we're talking about. Rather, from our perspective, at least, national security in the Arctic is an interconnected set of governance issues related to sovereignty, safety, and stewardship. Again, I stole this slide from Canadian counterparts. So again, a lot of similarities in what we're doing and the interactions that we're having with Canadians. Some of the national security imperatives that we refer to when we talk about why we have a strategy is border security, critical infrastructure protection, economic security, environmental security, food security, geopolitical stability, human safety, national defense, natural resource protection. These are kind of aligned with the bubbles up here, but they're not unique to those bubbles. There's an interconnected piece to all of these. Food security, for example. You have food security from an economic perspective in terms of the amount of fisheries that come out of the Bering Sea. You have food security related to the people that live in the region. And the stewardship, and the impacts that the human activity, the increased maritime activity are having on some of those fisheries in the region and on the mammals as well. So our updated Arctic strategic outlook will highlight how we have and plan to continue improving Arctic security through leadership, cooperation, and presence. Leadership to advance U.S. strategic influence in the Arctic region, cooperation to foster opportunities and outcomes and mitigate negative consequences shaping Arctic security, and presence, both operational and strategic. Operational presence to protect, regulate, and enforce. Strategic presence to lead both nationally and internationally. Major source document for the update to our strategy is a report by the Coast Guard Center for Arctic Study and Policy. Last year, they assembled a team of experts to review the Coast Guard's High Latitude Mission Analysis Report from 2010. And that addendum to that report reaffirmed the strategic value of the Arctic and the need for continued presence and leadership. I want to read just a couple of key findings from there. The Arctic transition period will be one of high variability, difficulty in prediction, rapid and nonlinear change, and consequent risk to maritime operators. Failing to scale up U.S. leadership in the Arctic to stay abreast of the increasing pace of activity will result in other powerful nations taking the lead in the region with critical geostrategic value. With that, I want to close with just a couple of graphics to kind of emphasize those points. This is a slide, if you've heard me speak before, I've used this a time or two, and I've borrowed this slide from Admiral McAllister when he was our District 17 commander. Really highlights a lot of it's not all of but a lot of the interesting vessels that are operating in or near U.S. waters and the lack of U.S. sovereign presence in the region. So fast forward for a year. This is a similar example of what we're seeing. It's certainly not a decrease in the amount of interesting vessels operating in and near our U.S. waters. And again, lack of our foreign presence, sovereign presence in this region. It's not for lack of trying. At this time frame, during September, I think Healy was down in the Seward area changing out crews, and I don't remember the white hole in the region, but it was either down around the Aleutian chain refilling with gas, but this is days away, at least 3, if not 5 days away to getting up just above the Bering Strait from some of these regions here. So a couple key points with this slide up here as the backdrop that I want to emphasize that I hope our strategy conveys in the update. As the Arctic continues to evolve, we must act today to prepare for future challenges and to shape those possible futures rather than simply responding to them. Currently, the Arctic is a cooperative domain, but a growing competitive space. And again, Commandant mentioned he likes to use this, so again, what my boss finds interesting, I find fascinating. Secretary Mattis's comments: we must cooperate where we can, but be prepared to compete vigorously where we must. And as the Commandant also said, competition doesn't always lead to conflict. A competitor in one sphere can be a partner in another. As a nation, we must assert our sovereign rights and responsibilities in the Arctic. And we must also promote responsible activity and governance, and we can best do that through leadership, cooperation, and presence. So with that, I'll turn it back over. Thank you.
Thank you, Shannon, very much.
We've been operating in the Arctic region really since the beginning of the advent of the Air Force in World War II. This is a cover of a book, The 1,000-Mile War, which basically depicts how the Japanese invaded Alaska, and air power really played a crucial role in defeating that invasion. And there was a lot of lessons learned about how we can better use air power and some of the environmental challenges that are very real to that region. as we moved to the 1950s, we decided that the Soviets are creating a very existential threat with long-range aviation and bombing and missiles, and we needed to start seeing better over the poles. So some of this technology that we started to look at was actually very rudimentary in the beginning. We had a ground observation corps, and I don't know if you're familiar with that, but there were advertisements across the United States for a 1 million-man volunteer service to actually use your eyes to watch and see and phone in when you saw things coming from you from the north. We've advanced in our technology, as you can see, starting from the border of U.S. and Canada, slowly moving up to mid-Canada, and then slowly to the distant early warning line. That's the technology that we had in the 1950s, and I'll speak a little bit more about that warning system later on. But then it wasn't enough for us just to see what was coming at us. We actually needed to figure out how we could physically intercept. So this last photo is from 1956, not a photo, it's actually a painting about our first generation fighter aircraft that we would use to intercept long-range bombers coming at us. And what's unique about it is that we were forward positioning these fighter aircraft so far forward. We were up at Thule, which is the northwest corner of Greenland, and up in the far-flung reaches of Alaska, really as far forward as we could possibly get. So while we've advanced our technology, we're now from first generation, we've moved up to fifth generation aircraft. We're still regularly conducting intercepts of long-range aviation in order to provide clear deterrence in our nation's national security policy. So the Arctic strategic significance has grown, and so has the Air Force's role and also the role of air power in the region. You all know that the region is large. It's about 1.5 times the size of the United States. And so this vast infrastructure, minimal land, really requires the use of air power to get around. It requires for access, for domain awareness, for timely response to attacks. We've really seen our role grow. We are there 365 days a year and 24/7. Our presence is not temporary, it is not seasonal, it is not periodic. We are there all the time. And why I foot stomp this is that often when I speak to folks, not in Alaska, but in the lower 48, they're very unaware of the role that the Air Force plays in the region. And to foot stomp this is a pretty staggering statistic that the 2016 DoD report to Congress showed that the Air Force contributes 79% of Arctic resourcing. So what does that 79% look like? This is just a brief map that walks through quite a few of our mission sets in the region. But from a Homeland Defense perspective, we have this dotted line that goes across the top of Canada through Alaska. That's the more advanced technology that we've created from that distant early warning site that I was talking about earlier. It's called the North Warning System, and it helps to see missiles and planes coming at us from over the poles. We also have ballistic missile warning sites that are up in Thule and over in Alaska. From a presence and power projection standpoint, Alaska is immensely crucial. We host F-22s, F-16s, KC-135s, E-3s, and then in 2022, we're going to have F-35s coming to Alaska. And so by that time, there will actually be more advanced fighter aircraft in Alaska concentrated there than anywhere else in the world. That's just foot stomps of how crucial this region is to our national security. And I'm sure if General Bussier, who is the leader of ALCOM, were to have been here today, he would have really highlighted the really crucial role that Alaska plays in our national security. And then in terms of mobility, I already mentioned the tanker aircraft that we have, which basically help fighters reach longer points around the globe. But we also have LC-130s, which are planes that have actually skis on them. And they can land on the Greenland ice sheet and in Antarctica, and they help the National Science Foundation with really crucial science missions that they have. They're based out of in the middle of Greenland there. And then lastly, from a mobility perspective, we have our Rescue Coordination Center, which works very closely with the Coast Guard daily, actually, and they have about 1,000 missions that they run every year in the name of search and rescue within Alaska. And then lastly, from a domain awareness and space situational awareness perspective, this is one of the Air Force's key mission sets. We have the AWACS, which is the long-range surveillance detection and command and control platforms, but we also have really crucial space situational awareness presence at Thule, Greenland, which is up in the northwest corner here of Greenland, and they track some 36,000 observations of satellites per day. So also want to talk a little bit about our future. I've just given you a brief overlay of what our current operations are and where we've come from, but As we all know, the Arctic is changing. From a defense perspective, the Arctic has long been considered a strategic buffer, but it's certainly becoming more porous. And that's happening both environmentally, physically, but it's also technologically with our adversaries' ability to come across and through the poles. The NDS has realigned us towards great power competition, and it's causing the Air Force to re-examine its strategic thinking about how we're able to approach these different problem sets. So we're looking at modernization, we're looking at building lethality and readiness, and we're looking at strengthening our allies and partnerships. And what does that look like from an Arctic perspective? Well, from an Arctic perspective, we're looking at the modernization of that North Warning System, that system across the 50-plus radars that we co-manage with Canada across the poles. We're looking at how do we adapt that system so that it's better able to react to advanced threats that are coming at us. We're looking at agile capability. Are we able to operate in austere environments, and are we able to create rapid operational exercises and provide agility for our forces? This is something that is very challenging in this operating environment. As you all know, we have permanent base structures, but are we able to have less permanent infrastructure and utilize that? We're also looking at environmental adaptation. As you all know, the environment is changing, and much of the Air Force infrastructure is relying on permafrost. So is our infrastructure capable of withstanding some of the changes that are occurring in the environment? And then we're also looking at a holistic approach to the region. Alaska surely plays an immensely important role, but we're also looking at holistically. So we're taking lessons learned from our allies. Last September, we took a group of circa 30 senior leaders from the Air Force throughout Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And we went up to Alert, which is the most northern inhabited location in the world, up in Canada. And they have a signal intelligence station up there, but it's learning some of the challenges of their remote operations and how they're able to manage supply chains. We've gained a lot from speaking with them. We also visited the Danish Joint Arctic Command in Greenland, where we talked about domain awareness, and we're working on how to better share our domain awareness data with them. And then across the Arctic Ocean, we're working with our Nordic allies to better to create more interoperability between our forces. We've recently signed an agreement called on Arctic Challenge exercise in order to help with their air operation exercise, helping develop it into a flag level exercise. And then additionally, I'm hoping to go out to visit them in early 2019 in order to learn further about their cold weather operations and their agile basing constructs. So this is just a brief snapshot of what the Air Force is up to, how we've evolved over the past 70 years, and where we're headed. Certainly, the technology has changed, but our mission has really stayed the same. We're still responsible for homeland defense. We're still responsible for domain awareness and space situational awareness, and we're still the predominant presence in the region. And we will continue to sharpen our focus and work with our allies and partners, as well as our service counterparts, as new challenges emerge. But thank you for the time.
While she's teeing that up, I'd just like to talk a little bit about some of the things that my colleague Shannon has brought up. First, my name is Jeff Parker. I represent the Navy. And Shannon and I actually are part of a working group that is part of the Fleet Board. A Fleet Board is an agreement that's signed between the Coast Guard and the Navy that we will have one fleet. The Coast Guard ships and Navy ships, sovereign immune vessels. And so we meet every 3 or 4 months to talk about Arctic issues, and it's a great way of exchanging ideas, too. So we do that. And Iris, when she talks about that 1,000-mile war, I would endorse that book. I spent a lot of time at the Naval War College as a professor up there. I used that book to write an exam just to get students to write about how hard it is to operate in the Arctic, the time, distance, space. But the lesson learned actually is that if you want to succeed, have a Navy operational commander, because the operational commander was out in ADAC, was Admiral Kincaid, and he had to control all the Army Air Corps, all the Army, the Canadian and the Canadian Air Forces to achieve one objective, and he did a pretty good job out there. So, and it's also interesting too that the president actually, and FDR, visited ADAC in '44 and Kodiak after that, after he'd been in Hawaii to decide that we were going to do an invasion in Leyte. So it's kind of interesting. All right, I'm going to ask a question. How many submarines do you see in this photograph here? There's two U.S. There's another one that you don't see. Okay, this is 2018 for ISEX. There is a British submarine there. So when we talk about how we're going to go after the Arctic, one of the things you're going to see in our strategy is we're not going to do it alone. We're going to do it with a whole of government approach, like Mike said. But as you're going to see, it's going to get into using our allies as well. So it's a very difficult place to operate. When Shannon was talking about all the vessels that are up there, you don't see these vessels because when they're in there, this technology that we have, this money, you don't see them. Okay, we get questions all the time from Congress. What are you doing up in the Arctic? Well, most of the missions that the Navy has to accomplish, we can accomplish with these submarines. They are a tremendous asset. It's unbelievable. No other nation in the world can do what we do with our submarines. So, all right. Can I go to the next one?
Oh, gosh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. All right. Oh, I did something wrong there. Okay. So, what are our Navy strategic objectives? Okay, our Navy strategic objectives in the Arctic, we really developed these. These come from the 2016 Department of Defense Arctic Strategy. Okay, it's mom and apple pie. The bottom line here, the promote partnership within the United States government and international allies, if there's any takeaway from the Navy, is that we are going to accomplish our objectives with the rest of the government, and we're going to need help from other people. We can't do it all ourselves. Okay, we've been up there a long time, and I just like to point out that picture there, you know, that we get up there to the Arctic. Here's the USS Honolulu. This is about 10 years ago, surfacing up there near the North Pole. Turns out that we're not the only ones there, all right? So a lot of times we think we're there. There's other folks there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about our strategy. The strategy, all the way over on the right, you see what I'm calling the strategic outlook for the Arctic. Okay, that's still in draft now. Over the years, the Navy has done a pretty good job of articulating what it wanted to do in the Arctic. In 2009, the then CNO, Admiral Roughhead, formed an organization called Task Force Climate Change because he saw that the things were changing. With Task Force Climate Change, the first thing that Task Force Climate Change did was come out with an Arctic roadmap for 2010. In 2014, we realized that that wasn't good enough. We needed, an update. We did a 2014 update. Senator Sullivan has convinced us that our 2014 update isn't really, keeping pace. We're going to have an Arctic strategic outlook out now. But we're developing that in the light of we've got a national security strategy, which the president has signed. Okay, it's directed by law in order to do that. The national military strategy will be coming out soon. That's also directed by law. There's a funny story about the national defense strategy is that a few years ago when Secretary Rumsfeld was the secretary, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs comes in there and he says, hey, here's my national military strategy. And Secretary Rumsfeld goes, what are you talking about? How can you write a strategy? I haven't even put out a strategy. Well, there's no statutory requirement for you to do so, sir. He goes, well, you pull that back, I'm going to write a strategy, then you can write a national military strategy. So that's just the way it is. And so from the latest national defense strategy, you keep hearing about this great power competition. That's where that comes from. This is Secretary Mattis, and he had a small team of people that put this thing together within DOD. And then we have just come out, and it's classified, a Navy strategy. Within the next week or so, the CNO is going to release his design. That is going to be the unclassified articulation of what is in our classified strategy. So that will be, and then that leads us to our Arctic Strategic Outlook. But the Arctic Strategic Outlook isn't just written in a vacuum. We look at the 2016 Department of Defense. Okay, what are the key elements that we're going to do? Okay, so you're looking at this. Okay, everybody's talked about this great power competition. I see this as a balancing of space, time, and force. And so this competition is going to happen over a wide spectrum. It's going to be global, it's going to be regional, it's going to be in cyberspace. It's going to be high-paced, and it's going to be long-term. So the CNO wants us to think in terms of decades. And, you know, some people have brought it up. I think the Commandant, when he was here, saying, hey, the Navy's kind of busy in all other places, all right? And we are. But one of the ways that we're going to have to do this, what are our themes? The themes that are coming out of our strategy is the Navy has to be agile. We're not going to do anything unless it's sustainable. And we're going to work with our allies and partners. And I'd just like to point out one thing that the CNO has directed us to do, and it's in conjunction with the Naval War College. In the Naval War College, we're working on what we call the Arctic Scholars Initiatives. It involves scholars from the United States, Canada, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. We really wanted to invite Russia, but guess what? The State Department said, no, you can't invite Russia. We've met twice. We're meeting again. We meet all the time, you know, in cyberspace, exchanging ideas, but we're actually going to produce our document in Bergen, Norway in April or May. So it's going to be hard for me to have to go to Bergen. If you've ever been to Bergen, you would love to go. All right. But the CNO gave us a charter. His charter was, what will the partnership structure look like? What's the operational concept that we're going to maintain? And in an emergent situation, how do we restabilize and how do we de-escalate? So together with these, with our allies, this is what we're going to come up with, and we're going to come up with a kind of a menu-driven thing. So what else has the Navy done recently? Well, one of the things, are you doing what you said you're going to do? You know, you had this Arctic roadmap, you had this Arctic strategy. Are you going to do what you're supposed to do? Are you doing what the DoD's Arctic strategy? Guess what? So somebody put something into the NDAA and said, we want you to look into this. We did a report to Congress. We said we could do our job very well. The GAO came 180 days after the NDAA, came after our report. 90 days later, the GAO came in and said, did a study, and this is the copy of their report. I could get into the details, but let me tell you what, we're really happy about this. Okay, they said that what we're doing aligns with the DoD strategy. They made no recommendations, no comments. So we took that as that we're on the right track. Also, you mentioned the Trident Juncture. Here's a photograph just of Trident Juncture. This is a Norwegian boat here working with the most capable ship in the world. Right now, it's the USS Harry Truman, and the sailors just had a wonderful time out there. So in closing, I'd just like to say this is from 2016. And here, this is ICEX, and you see the ice camp that's set up there. What do you see? You see an ice camp, but you see 4 flags. We are going to do, in the Navy, we're going to work with our partners in the Coast Guard, with the Air Force, throughout the whole of government, but we especially need the international community to help us. Now, there's just one thing that's in the international, dealing with the international community. When I was at the Arctic Scholars Conference up in Newport with, a lot of my Scandinavian colleagues, there was one Finn. When I showed him this, he goes, "What in the world are you talking about? Okay, that's not the Arctic." So we have a little bit of a conflict here with our allies, because our allies all see the Arctic a little bit differently. If you're from Finland or Norway, you wonder, why in the world does the United States have this big dip that goes into the Bering Sea and all around the Aleutians? Well, that's because it's law. And so in United States law, when we talk about the Arctic and we refer to the Arctic, we have to go by the law, the boundary that Congress has given us. So it's just another constraint that we have to deal with. We understand it, and our allies try to understand it. But to be honest with you, right now, The focus with our allies is in what's the Norwegians call the high north. So anyway, that's where our strategy is. That's where we're going. We think we're positioned very, very well. I would also recommend to you that if you haven't done it, Senator Murkowski has a wonderful homepage. And on her homepage, she has a 6-minute clip where she's questioning the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and she's asking them about the Arctic, and their answers are very enlightening. It's from a appropriations meeting on the 9th of May, and just all three people, the Senator, the Secretary, and the Chairman, all represent our country very well.
Thank you, Jeff.
Right.
So 2 recommendations, aside from all of this good content, we'll come back to. One is 1,000 Mile War, read the book,
Yes.
and Senator Murkowski's website.
Yes.
Okay, great.
NOAA has an Arctic strategy. We invest in the range of 100 to 120 million a year on Arctic science. So we feel like we're a player, and it's been interesting to be involved kind of in a lot of the new discussions around security. So NOAA, security, but I think in my slides you'll see we feel like we're kind of an integral part of security, and I think that's been substantiated repeatedly. The science, the environmental intelligence that we conduct is kind of the backbone for a lot of the thinking that has to go on from security. So if there's a theme for my talk, and I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, that would be it. Let's see, advance here. So here's NOAA's mission, and it kind of reflects what I've just said. We conduct world-class science in the atmosphere and the oceans, and try and take that data and information and transfer it as knowledge to solve a set of issues, a wide set of issues, and policy. So that's kind of what we're about. We conduct good science, and then we try and apply it in the right places. Thanks. Yeah. So next is Arctic Vision, and somehow I've lost the slides here, but I'll talk from this. So as I said, we have an Arctic policy, and it's conservation management and use based again on sound science to supporting productive, resilient communities and ecosystems. And then the global implications of the change that's occurring, I think, are very significant. And it speaks to a theme that I'm going to get to as I go through the rest of the slides. And that's, we know I certainly can't do it alone. It's been echoed here. We need partners at all different points and levels to support what we're doing. Huge, complex issues, and we're tackling part of that, but we can't do it alone. You see below some of the emissions there from coastal erosion, energy, obviously the diminishing ice, and then all the transportation issues that have already been referred to. So major drivers for our work. We have a new administration. The new administration talks about the Arctic a lot. We have, as our acting administrator, Admiral Gallaudet. He's been on the submarines that you saw in those previous pictures. He's very interested in the Arctic. So in talking with him and the other politicals, and then talking about what NOAA does in the Arctic, you see on the left some of the issues that they want us to think about when we think about the work that we're doing in the Arctic. You see on the right some of the criteria we've been using to establish the priorities for the work that we do there. And the work that we do there is a slide on it. I didn't put it up here, but obviously ice forecasting, very significant. Weather and water forecasting, again, the same. The changing ecosystem, documenting that and predicting where that's going to go. Another, charting. Charting is a huge issue for us. We don't have much of the Arctic charted. We do have an Arctic charting plan that we try and update every year, but we have a long way to go to chart the Arctic. So spill response is another. And then I think the final thing that we reference when we talk about our goals and objectives is international cooperation. It gets to the points that I was making earlier about can't do this alone. There's a huge Arctic. Alaska is one small part of that, and unless we get everybody else at the table, talking with us and providing their own information and data. We're just missing on a whole lot. So I have an opportunity slide here, and it's more, these opportunities are linked to the discussions that we've been having on a variety of different fronts with other agencies and entities. So starting with NOAA's leadership, Gallaudet repeatedly in talks has said, I want NOAA involved in security. I've talked early about where and how I think we fit for security, but to have the administrator talk about security as something he wants to see us involved with helps. So there's one great opportunity for us. You see 4 of the 5 agencies that are currently either doing strategic plans or revising them. We have met now periodically as 5 agencies to talk about what each of us are thinking and how we're proceeding. I think that's very beneficial. It's kind of a first. That hasn't happened much over the last few years. It's happening now. There is more and more dialogue between agencies, both federal and other, but certainly federal as it relates to some of the science agencies, and then the military, DoD, Coast Guard, and the like. That's been a really robust discussion and very fruitful. National Security Council, they have now formed an Arctic Security Working Group. Probably won't talk about it too much, but most of the folks at this table are involved. It has DoD, it has the intel community, but it also has NOAA at that table. We meet at the White House, started meeting 2-3 months ago, something like that, a couple of months ago.
I was on travel that first one, so I don't remember when.
At any rate, we've started to meet, and we're going to continue to meet. I just got notice that our next meeting is in a week or 2. And the discussions so far are, you have a really diverse group of folks in that room when you talk about intel, DoD, and science. And the theme is we all contribute something to the Arctic. We're all interested in trying to promote security, but we really don't know what each of us does, what we all bring to the table. And so the discussion has really started with, what do we all do in the Arctic? What do we bring to the table, and how can we better collaborate and integrate some of what we're doing so that we're better informed across the board? It's a very healthy discussion. There's a lot of spin-offs that have started. Iris and I are conducting a couple of discussions with other DoD and science agencies, and so that is another, I think, great opportunity. And then DHS, I don't know if it's been mentioned here, but Homeland Security has been working on an Arctic strategy of their own, and they are in the draft phase of that right now. But we are working with the DHS. We talk to them every once in a while about that strategy, and they're very quick to acknowledge that the science that we've been talking about and other science really is important as they think about their strategy. So, as I mentioned, NOAA is revising its plan. We hope to have a draft by the end of the year. Some of the real core components aren't going to change. We're going to still conduct science on the things that I talked about. But what we are going to do is, one, update an appendix which talks very specifically about every aspect of our work. So you can go to an appendix and see anything that NOAA does. It's all going to be in there. And then the narrative of the plan itself. And we are in the process of changing that narrative to more, I think, directly support and project the idea that the science that we are conducting is going to be used for things that maybe historically haven't been used for, but now are much more relevant, certainly including security. With that,
I noticed many people writing notes. A few have signaled that they may have a question. So why don't we do that in the time that we have left before the coffee break? Why don't we just go to questions? Mike Pulowski on my right, Sam on my right, and then we'll work our way over. Why don't we start up here in the front?
All of the activities you're talking about actually have a very important impact on local communities and actually in the economy. And I'd say, first of all, ISEX is a model exercise for that contracting and coordinating with the benefits on the ground. I'd say we often forget that science and the actual activity of science is itself economic development and actually has an important role to play, especially in our smaller communities. And that's where my kind of question to all of you comes from is, as you do these activities, what mechanisms and emphasis do you place, or do you need support from Congress to look at local partners in a way where I think of like the Barrow Arctic Research Facility? How are we really working with our local partners on the ground to see the benefits and the coordination of the activities? And again, I'd give a plug for the Navy on ISEX. You do a phenomenal job in the state.
Yeah, thank you. Great question. Who would like to respond, or all respond? David?
Maybe I'll start. First of all, over the last 2 or 3 years, there has been a concerted effort to develop with the local communities something called a standard of care. And essentially what that is as different agencies do research in the Arctic, before you get there, you consult with the local communities. You make sure that you understand what their subsistence hunting and fishing areas and issues are. You talk about the research some with them as well. We have several partnerships in the Arctic right now. There is one in particular that I can think of, just a brand new one, on red tide, where red tide is sneaking up into the Arctic, and we're working very closely with NOAA, with the indigenous folks there and the community to actually have them do the sampling and move from there. But I think it's a theme that's evolving. It hasn't been in place always, but more and more and more we are acknowledging the Arctic communities, their role, not only in providing us local and indigenous knowledge, but also in consulting with them as we do our research so that we're not impacting their daily lives.
I would say just Nettie was on a panel at the Wilson Center here a little while ago, and the panel that you had where we talked about the impact to the people was very eye-opening for me personally, and it's something that I think that the senators do very, very well. And oftentimes the Navy comes into some place where like a bull in a china shop, hey, move over, regular Navy coming through. And so thank you for, at the Wilson Center, putting that up there. And that's something that in the Arctic strategy, the DoD Arctic strategy, is something that's been considered for a long time. And so I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and I'll just speak from an Air Force perspective. I mean, with the preponderance of bases in Alaska belonging to the Air Force, and we have Eielson, Elmendorf, and then the long-range radar sites that are across the North Slope of Alaska, we work very closely with the communities, and we actually have someone that whose full-time job is to work directly with Alaska Natives and ensuring that when we're going to build something or when we're doing activities, that we consult with them first, that they know that we're coming, that if we're needing to do construction or contracting, that we work with the Alaska Native corporations hand in hand to make sure that what we're providing for the community, what we're doing in the community, is mutually beneficial. And to speak about the F-35 bed down that's coming, I mean, that's bringing in an influx of 10,000 plus employees to Fairbanks, which could really potentially override a community. But we're working really closely with the mayor, who has a point person directly responsible for coordinating with the Air Force as we bring in these folks to, again, make sure that it's mutually beneficial.
As Iris said, the District 17 office has a tribal liaison officer, and that's not just one person. I mean, that is one person, but they do a significant amount of outreach from the operational perspective. But talking policy-wise, so I try to travel out to the region 2 to 3 to 4 times a year to go to different areas to engage with the local communities and the Alaska Natives. A lot of times they come in during the summertime frame to enjoy the DC weather a little bit, I guess, which I can't understand why they want to come when it's 90 plus degrees here. But they often come to Coast Guard headquarters and we meet with them. But in addition to that, so we rely a lot on entities like the Arctic Domain Awareness Center. They hosted a workshop. Sorry, Trish, I always forget the dates. Was that January? March. I think January, because it was in Nome and it was blanketed white. But we had Coast Guard was there, NOAA was there, Alaska Command was there. The intent there was to talk a little bit about, as we're all updating our strategies, to understand their perspectives. They brought in a wide variety of representatives from Utqiagvik, Nome, Kotzebue, and I don't know where else. It was a significant number of Alaska Natives, so that we could hear directly from them what their issues, what their concerns are. So as I'm going through our strategy update, that's one of the things we're really trying to make sure that we emphasize a little bit more than our original version. Put those Alaska Native concerns and issues in there to help broaden out that message on it.
Thank you. Sam, and then we'll move a little towards the middle and then back over. We'll get them. We got enough time here for several.
I'm Dr. Sam Hancock of Emerald Planet TV, and one of the things we were talking about is all the changes going across the Arctic and specifically in Alaska. And you're talking about the Native Alaskans and incorporating them. What is happening as far as new food and energy sources within these areas? As this is a dramatic change, the supply chain is tenuous at best in some of these areas, depending on the time of the year. And is there any plan for distributed energy, even distributed food production in these areas that allows local green jobs, but at the same time to enhance the supply chain, whether it's for the military or NOAA or for civilian purposes? Because it seems like with all the changes happening, is we have to think of new ways as far as infrastructure and providing the basic needs of power, water, and food, in these areas. And thank you for being here. It's a great panel.
You want to start it with me too? Go ahead.
Honestly, I don't have much insight on that. I'd say probably the better insight would come from our District 17 offices as they monitor that type of activity. I'm not sure what we're doing, the Coast Guard, that's outside of our mission set, but we want to stay abreast of all that, one, so that we can leverage whatever infrastructure and other capabilities are in the region. But two, we need to understand things with the earthquake. Significant events like that happen frequently in the Arctic, in Alaska, that impact these local communities, and we're those first responders in a lot of cases. So we want to know what the capabilities are, what may be coming, that informs our operational decisions and our policy decisions moving forward. That's about the best I have to answer on that one.
David? I could actually fill in some blanks.
Why don't we have we'll get a microphone for Admiral Zhukov. Please.
Yeah, I probably spent about 6 years working those very same issues. So let's go back to when Shell was looking at doing exploratory drilling. They had a tremendous outreach campaign with the local communities, as did we. And the first was, well, what about contingency response? And this was in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. 47,000 responders. You could maybe get 15 up at Point Barrow. So huge challenges, and what would be the impact? At the same time, looking at a potential deep water port. If you look at Port Fourchon, Louisiana, that was really developed by the oil and gas industry. So there was a silver lining under this dark cloud as we started looking at oil exploration. But at that point in time, oil was pushing about $100 a barrel. Today it's trading at about $52 a barrel, and so it's not economically feasible. But at the same time, what is the interaction of all of that activity with whale migration and the whale quota, and then the ambient noise that's generated by this activity? And it's significant. And so the local community stipulated that none of this noise would occur until each village harvested its annual whale quota, and industry complied with that. So there was a very active dialogue between that. And then for fishery sustainment, that's a big part of a Coast Guard mission. We work with NOAA in terms of data management to make sure that we have sustainable fish stocks up in really in the Bering Sea. But as the Arctic warms, we'd be naive to think that fish stocks wouldn't migrate further north. China has a distant water fishing fleet of 20,000 vessels, literally all over the world. They're off the coast of Africa. And we have a growing population. Much of it depends on protein, fish protein as their primary source of protein. So what happens if fish stocks move further north? We have little to no enforcement capability to enforce that type of activity. And then with that activity comes uncharted waters, and then the potential for a foundering of a vessel, oil spill. But all of that, whether it's how do we distribute power, economically not feasible today. There was an initiative to move natural gas from the North Slope into branch communities. That would be of great benefit. That has since stalled. But those discussions are actively taking place. So the Coast Guard has been in lockstep with the Department of Interior, with Defense, with primarily the state of Alaska. and our First Nations. And when we talk about data, the best data we get is from our ears, is from listening, for the folks that have lived up there for a millennia. So we can appreciate not just the change to the environment, but also the impact on their culture as well. Thank you.
Let me just add that I mentioned earlier that we have an annual Arctic charting plan. And one of the things that we've been trying to target recently are the approaches to some of these rivers and smaller communities, just for the very purpose of all the barge traffic that supports them entirely. Really needs better charts to get into those areas. And so we've been working pretty hard to talk with those communities and begin charting activities on the approaches to some of the smaller communities that have the barge traffic. And then we have also been working on the surveying and response to the port access route study, which is a study that shows where we want to go as we go up through the Bering Strait and beyond.
Thank you. There's a panel at 1:15 chaired by Chancellor Emeritus Brian Rogers from the University of Alaska Fairbanks on policy, research, and development perspectives on America's Arctic, and it might be a good idea to tease out the energy equation in that panel as well. Thank you, Admiral Z, for weighing in on that as well. We have time for maybe one more question. Who would like the last one? You right in the middle. We'll get your microphone here in a second. Thank you.
Thank you. Jay Stern with the City of Nome, and this is a question for Mr. Barker. When Secretary Spencer was up in Nome in August, he made a public statement that the U.S. Navy has a tremendous role that it can play in stabilizing the region. And he acknowledged the role and presence of the submarine fleet, but he also said publicly that what we need up here are big gray ships with even bigger American flags. My question for you is, will that be reflected in the forthcoming strategy?
The strategy talks about what we need, and to be honest with you, the secretary, he can say that, but
remember, this is being recorded
right.
and will be streamed.
The CNO is the one who's going to have to decide, and actually, the decision on where ships go belongs to the combatant commanders. We supply the ready forces. It's going to be the combatant commanders. And so we won't do that unless there are requirements. The submarines are up there to deny a bastion to the Russians. Okay, that's why they're there. They're there so that the Russians don't have a bastion to operate from. They're defending the homeland. If there was a combatant commander that has a mission that would require a gray hull ship, then they would do a request for forces, and that request for forces would be adjudicated with all of the other requests for forces by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the people in the tank, all the other Joint Chiefs, and then that's how it would decide. So the CNO really doesn't have the capacity as the CNO. He, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, he has a say. But he does, we don't operate those ships. So the secretary could say it's a good idea. It's going to be up to the combatant commanders to actually put the vessels there.
Let me thank this extraordinary panel for a wonderful presentation.
Well, Mike, once again, lots to talk about. What do you think are the key takeaways from what we just heard?
Well, first of all, I find it very reassuring that the federal government has branches of the Department of Defense and other related branches looking to this new Arctic, preparing for it, leaning forward, preparing for what the future will bring for us. So that's one concrete takeaway, is that there is planning going on at the highest levels. The second is that they are looking at ways to leverage not only their assets, but their expertise. And the third is that there's a knowledge that this environment is changing. And so when you have to actually work in the theater that's changing, you have to prepare way out in advance. And so the preparation and the planning happening now for this changing Arctic is reassuring to an Alaskan, somebody who's interested in the Arctic, but also I think it should be a really good framework for perhaps a whole of government approach to this changing Arctic.
Great. Thanks again, Mike. And we have much more terrific content coming your way in the next part of our series. We hope you'll join us then. Until then, for Mike Sprague and for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for watching.